Welcome back. You're listening to Unlocked. I'm your host, Madeline Blair. And our guest today is Dr. Ilene Wasserman. Ilene, welcome to Unlocked.
Thank you, Madeline. I'm so excited to join you in conversation.
Indeed, it will be a conversation. My guest today, you have to know who she is. Her areas of expertise include executive coaching, leadership development, diversity and inclusion, change management, public speaking, and group facilitation. I'll tell you, there are so many things I want to talk to her about. Well, let's keep going. Ilene has been on the cutting edge of research and practice in creating inclusive workplace cultures and environments through strength-based methodologies, capacity building, and relational leadership and strategy. We're going to tease those out, by the way, today. She has worked with both private and public sector organizations to build and strengthen diverse leadership teams, staff relationships, and effective communication strategies to help them achieve their goals. She serves as a senior fellow of the Wharton Leadership Institute, a fellow of the Taos Institute, vice president of the board of the Lewin Center, a member of NTL, the National Training Laboratories, and steward on the board of the CMM Institute. And I had to look up CMM, by the way, and I think it's the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution.
That's correct. That's correct.
Outstanding. All right. Well, I think that's probably enough for people to know you need to be listened to. So I have more things to say, but I'm going to leave it there. Again, welcome to Unlocked, Ilene.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
Yes.
It was a fun write, and it was really fun to have made it a bestseller.
Yes.
Okay. I always like to ask my guests to tell the audience a little bit about how you decided to do what you focus on today.
You know, what a wonderful question. And I'm often asked that question, not only by clients, but by people that I teach and mentor. And part of my answer is I kept following my passion. And I've been in this work long enough that in some ways my evolution in my field has paralleled the evolution of the field. Because as you know, Madeline, the field of organizational development, leadership, and especially with an emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion, has really grown tremendously in the last 50 years. And I was very fortunate to have mentors along the way that helped me shape the principles and practices of what I do. And together, we were defining the field. So I really started out in group process, social work, and counseling psychology. But from a very early start, I was working as a consultant in healthcare and then in multiple sectors of organizations when I shifted from just doing healthcare consulting to doing organizational development and leadership with one of the consulting firms that really was helping to define the field and the cutting edge of defining the field. I was very lucky.
You know, it's wonderful when in your life you can look back and say, wow, I was specially blessed. I used to like to use the word blessed because we bless each other. And those were opportunities where you just were able to grow and enhance. Thank you for that story. It's wonderful. You know, the show today is called Expanding Who You Are. I talked about the fact that in my practices, I suggest that people write their stories to discover who they are. I know there are many other ways to do it as well. How do we learn who we are so that we can really begin to work on expanding it?
Thank you for that question. I think that in some ways, every moment, every relationship is an opportunity for discovering others and in the process, knowing yourself better. And one of the gifts of working and elevating diversity, different cultures, different perspectives in teams and organizations is that I do believe, just like you said in your introduction, that we have the opportunity to know more about ourselves in relationships, particularly with relationships with people who are different from us, but also in relationship to people who are similar to us. And one of the opportunities I had along my career journey was to do doctoral research while I was working full time. Yeah. And I do say it was a gift because I had the opportunity to study what it was that I was most intrigued by in my work. And that was, how was it that people were growing and developing in relationship to others who were different from them, not necessarily at the personal level only, but also at the group and cultural identity level.
Oh, and you have to explain what that means.
Okay. So one of the things we've been learning a lot about as a crash course, particularly in the last 2 years, but has really been part of the conversations for 40 or 50 years, is what does diversity look like at the workplace? And that's spilling over into community. So when we look at diversity, there are so many dimensions of diversity. We talk about race, we talk about gender, and we talk about nationality, and we talk about sexual orientation, and we talk about different ability. But increasingly, those are not necessarily discrete categories. Mm-hmm. We're looking at them in ways of reference points of people defining themselves in multiple ways. And all of that makes us who we are, the histories that we carry, the stories, as you talk about the stories that we inherit from our families. They all shape how we wake up in the morning and how we see the world, how we read the news, and how we show up at work.
I am really struck by some of the things that you're saying, because so much of our distinctions of different people have to do with appearance, and yet it's that formation that is really the difference. For example, I often tell audiences that I grew up on a farm, and I ask the audience, did anybody else grow up on a farm? And like maybe one hand goes up. Mm-hmm. And I say, oh, you are so deprived because you don't understand what it means to grow up on a farm. Mm-hmm. and it is amazing the difference in terms of my perspective and their perspective. And neither one is better or worse. They're just different.
Yes. I grew up in the northeastern part of the United States. Recently, I took a 2-week vacation around Thanksgiving, which is a holiday that is in the United States, and drove to Colorado and back.
Wow. If
I tell you what a wonderful experience that was to recognize how limited or how the piece of my perspective growing up in the Northeast part of the United States is just one way of looking at things. And over the course of my career, I have traveled and worked all over the country of the United States, as well as other countries in the world. And I come to this with such a curiosity and humility around my perspective being just one way of seeing things. Mm-hmm. And to see others' perspectives doesn't mean that I have to give mine up, doesn't mean that I have to change mine. But as a philosopher, Martin Buber said, I could humbly hold my perspective side by side with yours and see what I can learn from that.
Oh, I love that.
And what I learn is not just what yours is, but I see mine in a new light. And that's what I mean by the richness of discovering who I am in relationship to you. One of the things about the research I did that was a surprise finding, it's always wonderful when you're doing research to have a surprise.
A surprise, yes.
Yeah. Is that I went into the research thinking I was going to study traditional ways of framing diversity at the workplace. At the time, it was a lot of race, gender, sexual orientation, different ability. And look at that in that context. But then what happened was it was 2001. It was the fall. And all of a sudden, things in the United States were rippling because of the Abrahamic tradition dialogue groups that were sprouting up after 9/11. And so I added a multi-faith dialogue to my research. Oh. And one of the things that was a surprise, both in my context of corporate diversity and diversity in nonprofits, and in the work I was looking at in multi-faith dialogue, was that some of the differences were within group. Mm-hmm. So somebody that I think is like me, and I'll call it out here, I identify as a woman, I identify as white, and I have multiple other aspects of my identity, including my faith orientation and where I grew up, and my generation. And the surprises came when somebody who I thought was like me said something that was so different from my own perspective. I expected it from somebody who looked different. But how do I engage and get curious about that when it's somebody who I think should be like me?
Yeah. So that was a surprise. You're absolutely right when you're doing research to find a surprise. Actually, my work on resilience was a surprise from another piece of research that I was doing on how people learn.
Interesting.
But it's rich. It's what you should be doing. Our eyes should always be open. Our minds should be open to what we see there. And I really appreciate the fact that you talk about the differences within what we think are commonalities. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Indeed, because we're all individuals. Period. But I also like the fact that you touch on growing as an individual as you grow in relationship to other people. So in other words, it's almost because you are in contact with other people and interacting with them that you grow.
Yes. Yes. And here is where I think is the potential of the work that I and we do as executive coaches. Mm-hmm. And also as consultants. So I make that distinction because I think it's important. The executive coaching field has just expanded exponentially in the last, as you would know that so well, 10 years. And we may think of executive coaching as one-on-one work. But when you're working with executives and leaders shape the culture of organizations. And the work of leadership in the 21st century is really a different dimension than it was in the 20th century and before that. Because leadership is no longer about being the expert and telling people what to do. Mm. The capacities for leadership are, as Ron Heifetz would say, adaptive. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. That the capacity for leaders to be effective in this complex world requires a level of development and a curriculum, as Bob Keegan would say, and Lisa Leahy, that is far expansive than what we may have been trained to do. Mm-hmm. It requires relational competencies about being able to be humble, to hold your perspective as one possibility, to elicit the best from others, to explore and inquire into, with great curiosity, the stories of others, and shine a light on that in a way that people might not even know until the invitation presents itself.
I love the phrase that you are curious about others, and that's part of inclusive leadership capabilities or competencies, to be curious about others. You know, the beautiful aspect of that is that highly resilient people are insatiably curious. They're always open. You know, that piques my curiosity. I'm going to pursue it. So that's a perfect complement to a leadership position, because you've got to be resilient, which goes back to your adaptive language. Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. You know, I'm really tempted. Sometimes when I have guests on, I say, let's do a demonstration. So I'm going to ask you, would you like to pretend to counsel me? I'm an executive. I've run this company for 30-some years. And help me with this thing you keep talking about, inclusiveness, or whatever it is that you think I need to work on. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah, let's play a little bit.
All right.
Yeah. So, Madeline, it's wonderful to meet you. And beyond exploring all of the kind of concrete information about your company, what you do, how many people, etc., I think I want to start, for the purpose of a demonstration, with asking you about a time that you felt particularly challenged by someone or some people on your team in how they brought themselves fully, and inviting them to bring themselves fully to the team. Can you think of a time?
I don't think it was yes, I can think of a time. It was not necessarily a really difficult challenge, but it was a challenge because I had 4 professionals who were working with me on a rather large organizational development project. And I wanted to make sure that team really worked seamlessly, as if they were one person. And what I did was I asked them what they wanted to accomplish in the work that we were doing together. And they named what they wanted to accomplish. And because I asked that simple question, they began to see the threads that, well, you know, if I achieve this, I'm really helping you achieve that. And that team was amazing in terms of what they actually produced. And it was such a simple thing to ask them, you know, what do you want to do in this? What do you want to achieve? We knew what the project was. We knew what the mission was. We knew what the objectives were. And we were committed to achieving them. But this additional thing, yeah.
So I want to stay with that, because I really I appreciate in your sharing that particular episode the ways in which you didn't start by saying, you do this, you do this, you do this. You started with a question. You started with an invitation.
Yeah.
And it's possible, I don't know enough yet, but it is possible that the invitation that you offer to each of these people invited them to articulate their vision of how they were showing up on this team in a way they hadn't articulated before you asked the question.
I think that's a very good observation, or maybe I should say a hypothesis, because it is very possible that happened. For example, one of the members of the team was an artist. Now, we're doing organizational development work, So you have psychologists on the team, sociologists on the team,
Mm-hmm.
and an artist. And yet, after they did, express what they wanted to achieve, even the artist could see his link, and likewise they to him. Yeah. So
Yeah. And I think that's also an example of something else that I see very often in my work, which is I am showing up in this role. So today, in my conversation with you, Madeline, I am showing up as an executive coach, as a business owner of an organizational consulting firm where I bring teams together to service clients as a team. And I also teach and I also write. That's who I'm showing up as. You may not know that I'm a photographer. I'm an amateur photographer, but photography is something that is always a thread in how I show up, and it's in the background. And I don't know if this artist was showing up as a consultant, but oh, by the way, was also an artist. I highlight that because I hearken back to a time when I was working with an oil company in Louisiana. And I was meeting with a group. And I invited them as a check-in because, just by the way, every time I convene a group, we start with check-in and we end with check-out. And my clients know this, and I inherited this from Edie Seashore, who was a wonderful mentor in this field. So I invited people to share something that was inspiring for them in the last 24 hours of their life. And this man, who was an operator on the oil rig, talked about his radio station. Who knew? He was running a radio station. No one in the room knew that. They'd worked with him for 10 years. No one in the room knew that. So there are so many aspects of our stories that lay below the surface because we may not think they fit here or they're relevant here. And yet they are a part of who we are.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this artist happened to be a professional artist. That was what he did in his life. But I had him on the team because he sees as most artists do, they see the world differently. And I wanted him to question the others. And that was his role.
What a wise decision on your part. So let's look at that as a way of understanding you as leader. That you're curious, that you inquire, that even as you were telling the story, you were drawing a connection among the threads, and that you chose an aspect of diversity that would elevate the rich fabric of the team. Yeah. And then I would want to, and I don't know how long you want to go with this experiment. And for the record, this was not rehearsed. But what I would want to do is explore with you what were the surprises that emerged for you from how this team worked, and the ways in which they each and all elevated aspect of themselves that might not have been apparent individually.
I'm not sure I can remember all the details. What I do remember is that when we got to the end, we had produced something that the client was very happy with. Mm-hmm. It's always critical.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
We met all of the objectives. Mm-hmm. But to me, the wonderful thing as well was that every one of their personal objectives had been achieved as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
And because we share some principles about what you talk about is what you create, mm-hmm. and that the story is always emerging. And so by inviting them to articulate their visions and then reflect back on how did that happen, I wonder what would have been predictable and what would have been a surprise.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Well, thank you for diving in and doing this as a model, because I think we talk about executive coaching, so you hear it so much. And what does it actually look like? And this, I hope, will help people understand. It can look like something like what we just did. But what I enjoyed very much about it was that what you did was you kept opening up the story and opening it up and opening it up.
Yes. Thank you. One of the things that I want to underscore about executive coaching is there's a piece of it that is the curiosity and the inquiry and the probing that we had an opportunity to touch on. But as somebody who comes to organizational consulting from a leadership perspective, and somebody who comes to executive coaching from an organizational development perspective, I think that there is a quality of the work that is not just looking at the leader as person, but looking at the leader as person and role, and continuously inviting the distinction and the connection about person and role.
This is amazing. I had a conversation with a woman executive recently, and she was confusing the person and the role.
It comes up all the time. There are certain things that come up all the time that are the things that are supported by our frameworks, and the frameworks we bring to our clients are the things that are helpful. So making the distinction between person and role is one of them. Making the distinction between what is the individual interpersonal level of the work, what is happening at the team level, what is happening at the group level, and some of that is about differences that make a difference. And I'll come back to that. And then what's happening at the organizational systems level, meaning what are the structures, the policies, the practices, what are the implicit enactments of the culture, as our dear Ed Schein would talk about, that are impacting how we do what we do. And asking the very simple question, how can we do it better in the next moment?
Yeah.
Those holding the complexity of those multiple layers is a critical competency of a good executive coach.
Yes. Yes, it is. I often talk about the fact that as a leader, you have to be able to handle ambiguity.
Yes.
And that complexity is what is directly linked to that aspect of ambiguity, because you don't know what's going to happen, because there's so many things you can't even keep them all in your mind at one time.
Yes.
Yeah, but that is a competency you've got to have.
Yes.
Well, one of the things I'd like to expand on, because you hinted at it, and that is, you said you used the word framework, which I like, but also when you're working with organizations, you want to be bringing in different methodologies. Are there particular methodologies that you find particularly useful when you're teasing out these issues of team and group and sort of thing?
Yeah. I think that's a really important question. And as I reflect on that question, I want to say that sometimes I'm invited into an organization or I'm hired into an organization. I say we have a small consulting group, and I seldom work alone, because my philosophy is I have but my perspective.
That's right.
And if I am offering a parallel to the work I'm doing, I need to be in partnership with some of my colleagues that are part of ICW Consulting Group. And so sometimes we're invited in by an organization to strengthen the organization and the leadership team component. And sometimes we're specifically invited in because people are wanting to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And the way we distinguish ourselves and what we do at ICW Consulting Group is that we take an organizational development culture approach to DE&I work, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work. And that when we're doing organizational development and leadership and team development, we are always bringing the diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging lens to that work. They're intertwined for us in ways that are indistinguishable. So that's one of the models. And we talk about working at those different levels, the individual, group, team, and systems level.
Got it.
The other aspect of how we work that informs our work, implicitly and explicitly, is what we call a strengths-based approach, because oftentimes when you talk methodology from a theoretical basis, you lose people. And I learned that 25 years ago on my first appreciative inquiry project, where I was working with a CEO. I was working with his leadership team. This is a very well-known case that has been written about in the appreciative inquiry books and journals, Green Mountain Coffee Roasters. And so I started working with Bob Stiller, the CEO, who would proudly be happy about me talking about him and his team. And I started working with Bob and his team. And I said, he said, I'd like you to work with the whole organization. And I was just coming from the time when I worked in a what was then traditional way of working with, where we would come in as the consulting team, and we would diagnose the issues and then offer some recommendations based on findings. And I was just experimenting with what is now called in the theoretical literature dialogic OD, meaning how do you center the client? It's, dialogic OD means rather than me doing all the interviews and then telling you what the issues are, how do I engage people in the organization talking with each other and help them make sense of it? Because in the first model, I'm developing these wonderful relationships with people in the organization, which, oh, by the way, I love doing. But I don't live in the organization. In the latter approach, we are working with people in the organization and helping them create the structure, the script for doing interviews where they are developing relationships simultaneously to discovering what it is that is already working well and what would make it work better. And they're having those conversations. And simultaneous to having those conversations, they are making some of those improvements because they can. So that was such a critical juncture in my work.
Yes. And, I remember back before this sort of thinking was around, that there were all these discussions about how you get buy-in to the final result.
Right.
Well, you had buy-in from the very beginning because it was theirs.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like I don't have to sell something to somebody who is already creating it. And it really was a shift, that old joke about, that how does a consultant tell time? They ask you for your watch, something like that. I don't remember the joke, but it really, and you and I know this as an appreciative inquiry approach, which was the seeds. And because I was so well steeped and well mentored in organizational development, I was able to really make the most of the principles of appreciative inquiry. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I don't know if I had a chance to mention this, but there's a journal called the Appreciative Inquiry Practitioner that is a journal of stories in our field that people write about quarterly. And I had the opportunity to be the guest editor of the November 2022 issue, along with Tanya Cruz and Marlene Ozawa. And we edited this journal collecting stories about people who were doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work around the globe using a strengths-based appreciative approach.
You know, I have to do a couple of things. One is tell the audience that we've talked about appreciative inquiry a lot here, and we've talked about it in some of the other shows that I've had. For example, Diane Whitney was one of my guests. It's a philosophy of how you work with people that says, let's draw from them what works, what has worked in their lives, what gives them life, so that it's always in a generative mode as opposed to a problem-focused mode. When you use it, oftentimes clients will get nervous that you haven't talked about the problem. And finally, they begin to see that the problem disappears when they begin to act on the kinds of things they see that really work. So that's appreciative inquiry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And what I also like to share with clients is that the problem, as you said, Madeline, gets addressed because when we're talking about problems, it's really in the context of, I wish it was different. And if I said to you, and what would it look like if it were different? Then that is what you move toward.
That's what you move toward. That's right. Our brains are amazing. They figure out, this is what you're thinking about. Okay, let's move in that direction. Absolutely. I want to shift our conversation a little bit. You know, we've just come through a pandemic. It's not really over, but we feel like we're moving into another phase of it. And it's placed enormous stressors on business. What have you seen in terms of what's the changes and what's the meaning from this unusual time for you in your work?
It's something I'm thinking about all the time. I want to name the context in which from which I'm responding to your question, Madeline. One is that a number of the clients that ICW Consulting is working with, we've been working with starting in 2019, 2020. So we've been working with them through this period. The second context is the work I do at the Wharton School, which is I'm the lead coach of the Advanced Management Program, where before the pandemic, senior leaders from all over the world would come to campus for 5 weeks. Wow. And we had to, and we do that twice a year, we had to do some major adjusting, thinking, because you remember in the beginning of the pandemic, we thought maybe it'll end in 2 weeks, maybe a month.
We really thought that.
Yes. Yeah, so we kept so that first AMP program at Wharton that was scheduled for June of 2020 became the program for October of 2020, and we said, maybe you could come to campus, but we had people from Australia that couldn't leave. We had people from India that couldn't leave. So we were, talk about adaptive leadership, we were adapting in real time. So those are the major two contexts that I'm speaking from, in addition to doing a lot of reading about what other people are observing. One of the things that I will humbly say is that I was using Zoom for 10 years before the pandemic. So Zoom wasn't new to me. And I've had an office out of my home for 30 years. So that wasn't new to me. And so when we had to make the adaptation to working in the way that you and I are working today, I was thinking, this is working great. Now, I had to remind myself in scheduling my own day that I couldn't go from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom to Zoom to Zoom. So let's just talk about that. And yet, Madeline, I live in a comfortable space. My children are grown.
Yeah.
I have resources to be able to order food. What we learned in the pandemic was the disparities that affect people were accentuated.
Yep.
What we learned in the pandemic was that work-family issues, on the one hand, we learned that people could integrate more, but we also learned that people were extremely burdened, losing childcare suddenly, having dual career families working and trying to juggle things without having the extra space of having an office. We learned a lot. One of my clients I have seen in person and have been able to conduct 2 whole organization full day meetings with in person. We call those whole organization meetings summits, but I've been able to do that in person. And the first time that we held one in person, which was November of 21, I recognized that thinking this was working just fine, I realized we were missing something when we showed up in person. Another client that I'm working with, which is a client out of the National Institute of Health, has not gone back fully. I'm still working with them on Zoom, and they're still working with each other on Zoom. Because organizations that have invited people to come back 2-3 days a week, if you're on my team, we may not be in the office the same 2 or 3 days. And so we're working on Zoom anyway. And there are certain regions of the country where I have a 10-minute drive to work. It's not a big deal. But there are certain regions of the country where I have a 45-minute drive to work without traffic. And I realized during the course of the pandemic that I was gaining 2 to 3 hours back in my day.
Oh, yeah.
So the answer to your question is, it's very complicated. It's very complicated. People who lost their jobs found ways of being entrepreneurs that they never knew they were capable of. So I know when I was driving cross country, there were some more rural areas that I was looking to stay for the night at a hotel, and I realized it may have been a Marriott, but they didn't have staff.
That's right.
So I don't know if I'm answering your question in the way you were hoping, but I'm sure you'll probe.
I think it was probably the way I phrased the question, but what I was hoping for was that you were seeing shifts within organizations and how they have adapted to some of these issues, and especially in relationship to what you call inclusiveness. You know, how have organizations recognized the need for that and done it even in this situation? Or is it not?
The thing that was happening at the same time as the pandemic, I talk about them as the 3 overlapping circles, although I'm sure there were more circles we could add, is you had the pandemic, you had the George Floyd murder, which we talk about as George Floyd, but it was really a tipping point in so many ways. There have been so many murders. I did a project 25 years ago, in a city in the middle of the country that was based on a police community incident, handled extremely well, I might say. But these incidents have been going on for decades. But there was a way in which the George Floyd murder hit people because we were all home. We were all watching our TVs. We were seeing the same thing. And the intensity of it really prompted organizations to respond in ways that they felt pressured that they had to. What that meant in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space is many people were responding quickly, and many people were coming into providing services quickly. And one way of doing that was to provide workshops, short workshops. And there is something to be said for doing workshops on implicit bias, on microaggressions. In some ways now we're seeing the ripple reaction to those workshops. And what concerns me when organizations are only providing training programs and are not looking at it systemically and are not looking at it relationally is that the message is, what people hear is that some people feel like no matter what I do, it isn't right. Some people feel like, different groups, different identity groups have different reactions. I think what I want to speak to is what is the work? What is important? And what I talk about with clients all the time is that what is critically important is to recognize the complexity in relationships, to recognize that there are some places that I have a power dynamic that I may not have been aware of. There are some places where how I'm perceived, the story that others have of me, and the story I have of myself may be different. And I did a 4-minute video called Bumper Car Moments and Relationship Recovery. And it really sums up that I think that we all have a lifelong curriculum around what many multiple dimensions of diversity are and the implications. And just because my very close friend or my very close colleague is Black doesn't mean that what I learn in relationship to him or her or them is applicable to every other person I meet.
Got it. Thank you for that expansion. I cannot believe that our time is almost over.
My.
The implications that you discuss are so many. What I really pulled out, though, was that we must recognize the complexity. And let's not, the implication to me is, let's not look for one-size-fits-all solutions. Let's not look for simple things. Let's recognize the complexity of it.
And to realize, if I can just quickly say, that it's not about getting it perfect and getting it right. Because if that's the goal, I'm going to stop engaging because I'll be afraid. The goal is to develop the quality of relationship so that if you make a mistake, there's relationship recovery.
Excellent. In fact, I was going to ask you if you wanted to give my audience just a few final words so that they can leave with something, your final words.
What I'm learning in relationship with you, Madeline, is that all of this, like you said, is about recognizing the complexity of the situation, not getting overwhelmed by it,
right,
but engaging in a learning mindset and a mindset that's forgiving of yourself and forgiving of others at the same time that it's relentless around learning. Because it's one thing to be forgiving, but it's another thing to be doing so with the commitment to do what you need to do, to be a good leader, to be a good teammate, in service of, as you talked about with your team, the collective vision of what you're there to create together.
Marvelous. Ilene, I want to thank you again for your time that you so graciously gave us and all these wonderful stories and ideas.
Can I add one small thing?
One small thing.
Plug for peer coaching. We talk about executive coaching.
Yes.
We don't all need an executive coach, although those are wonderful. But the and there is that there are ways in which you learn, grow, and develop with peer coaching relationships that are rich.
Absolutely. In fact, you'll hear more about that as I go on the rest of the show.
Okay.
Ilene,
thank you so much. Thank you.
Wow. That was an amazing discussion. And I'm so appreciative of what Ilene has brought to us. I love this aspect of recognizing the complexity and that we have to have a learning mindset. Everything I read is all about continuous learning. We have to keep that in. And of course, resilient people are curious, and curiosity is the door to learning. Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unlocked. And if you have, make a comment in social media about what you learned and might do differently as a result. And if you're on YouTube or LinkedIn, please click the like button. Better yet, subscribe or follow me. Check out my book, Unlocked, for practices that actually work. And I'm also going to call attention to the fact that our guest today has written Communicating Possibilities. See, she uses that wonderful word, possibilities. So I will commend that book to you as well. All right. Now, if you would like to explore what it means for yourself to build and nurture your resilience, send me an email. Madeline@MadelineBlair.com. It's right there on the screen, and I'll get back to you. Now, if you would like to join a group mentoring program called Unlocking Together, or are just curious about it, write and tell me that. It's a program, by the way, where you're going to do peer coaching. Exactly what Ilene was talking about. We're going to develop that capability so you can do it for yourselves. So I'll send you more information if you let me know about the time and keep you informed when the program begins. I want to thank you for joining us on this segment of Unlocked. I'm Madeline Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you